First of all, I thank the organizers, especially Dr. Hakim, Dr. Saudin, uh, the Center for Dalit and Tribal Studies, Department of History, MES, Mampad College, uh, for inviting me for this lecture and having me to share some of my thoughts, some of my ideas uh, about the tribal studies in the country, and some of the work we have been doing with my friends, with my colleagues in the country with regard to tribal studies. So I don't have any PPT or anything. I'll try to share readouts, bit of um, writings, whatever I have, and I'll try to see that how simple and how less time I can take, so that we can have some bit of discussion. Before I talk, interestingly, it is the coincidence that tomorrow, that is the 13th September, is the day of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Day, which is celebrated all over the world by all indigenous peoples. It is in commemoration of the UN General Assembly, which adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on 13th September 2007. And India happens to be one of the signatory countries. And all over the country, these celebrations had began through different webinars, different consultations, discussions in different states all over the country from 9th. And every day there has been regional, state level discussions around the tribal issue, Adivasi issues. And tomorrow is going to be the culmination of this week-long celebration or observation of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Day. So I take this opportunity to coincide with that event and share my thought. And it so happens that that time when Dr. Saudin suggested the date for today, I was not conscious about this day, and I agreed, and I'm happy that this our talk is coinciding with this 13th September. What I'm going to talk is, I'm going to talk about one of our books which has recently come as e-book. That is, the title itself is Problematics of Tribal Integration, which is an e-book which is available freely online. So I like to share about that book. Some of my students also have joined in this webinar, and they will find that yes, I'm saying something which they have already heard from me. But for the larger audience, I like to share basically a new discourse which we are trying to work on with regard to tribal studies in the country, and as an initiative is a project of knowledge. Project of knowledge production, or the project of theorization process with regard to tribal studies in the country. I'd like to share some of our thoughts, initial thoughts, which we have premised as part of this larger platform. So as I said, this book I'm referring and I'm going to talk about is Problematics of Tribal Integration. And I'm taking the view, I'm taking the basic premise of the context of that book as part of this webinar. I'm sharing about that. So if we look at, I'm not going to all the statistics, how many tribal peoples are there in the country or in the state of Kerala we am not getting into the numbers. But if to contextualize, if we say that we are referring to the people who are called as Adivasis or tribals or scheduled tribes in the country by the state. Uh, what is the volume? Who are they? So in that context, if we say that we know that we have about say 8% of the total population of the country, consisting of 300 plus communities in the whole of our country. We have small number of Adivasi communities to the large communities, like we have the groups like Santals or Bhils or Gonds, whose population is about 40 to 60 lakhs in the country, 40 to 50 lakhs. On the other hand, we have the people who are just in, say, like Andaman Nicobar Island, we have Onjis and other groups in Andaman Nicobar Island who are just few numbers, 20, 25. Okay, so we have the large communities like Gonds or Wheels or Santal, so whose numbers range from 40 to 50 lakhs in the country. On the other hand, we have 20 to 35 people. In the same way, especially if we see the distribution, we have, say, for example, I come from the state of Odisha, and my home district, in my home district itself, the tribal population is about 10 lakhs. Okay, in one district alone, in my home district, we have such kind of population. On the other hand, we have very thin distribution of tribal population. Like in Kerala, for example, we have about just 5 lakhs in the whole of state. Okay, and then we have some states, we have a small number in terms of number, but whereas in northeastern states, if we go, we have 80 to 90% of the population who belong to this particular community, whom we are referring as tribals or scheduled tribes or indigenous peoples. And if we see that they are in the range of numbers in terms of development, what we refer or we call it, they are in the different ranges. And so when we look at these communities, and when we are referring to this community as part of researchers, as part of the academicians who are involved in with the issue of knowledge, with the issue of tribal studies, and who are engaged in the, we'll begin with Jawaharlal Nehru, what he had remarked or made a statement at the opening session of Scheduled Tribe and Scheduled Area Conference in New Delhi on 7th June 1952. He had stressed to the participant as part of his speech with reference to the tribes or Adivasis that you may talk here in this conference day after day about the development programs in regards to schools and other matters, but you will fail completely if you do not touch the core of the problem. The problem is to understand these people, make them understand us, and create a bond of affection and understanding between us. After the achievement of independence, our independence, sorry, I have. Yeah, the problem is to understand these people, make them understand us, and create bond, affection, and understanding between us. So after the achievement of independence, the basic problem of India taken as a whole is one of integration and consolidation. Political integration is now complete with the independence, but that is not enough. We have to do something much more intimate than political integration, and that process takes time. It is not a matter of law, it grows. You cannot force it to grow Just as you cannot force a plant or a flower to grow, you can only nurture it and produce conditions where it grows. So the greatest problem in India is psychological integration and consolidation to build up a unity which will do away with provincialism, communalism, and various other isms and which disrupt and separate, and so on. So if you see what he is trying to say, that so political integration had taken place with the independence, but there were much more things to do, which Jawaharlal Nehru had stressed in his speech. Similarly, in another conference in '59, one of the anthropologists from Calcutta University, in his presentation with regard to a plan for assimilation of tribals of India, he categorized the tribals into broad 5 categories: nomadic, food gatherers and pastorals, shifting cultivators of hill slopes, cultivators of plateau or foothills, partially assimilated to Hindu social systems, fully assimilated tribal groups occupying a fairly high social status among Hindus. For each of these groups proposes 7 categories for getting them properly integrated to our nation. These measures he discusses separately for each, where economic, educational, medical, political, social, religious, and psychological. And two people I have referred in the beginning itself. One hand, Jawaharlal Nehru is stressing about integration, which is much more than just political integration. On the other hand, another anthropologist is seeing that how in that particular time, immediately after independence, how they were planning to assimilate the larger Indian society, and in that point of time, how the tribals were categorized into different categories. Now, since then, if I refer this two great peoples, one is Verver Elwin, and another one is G.S. Gure. Elwin, who was a missionary who came to India in 1927 as a missionary, but seeing the Gandhi's freedom movement, he became the follower of Gandhi, and he joined his movement. And subsequently, he became more Indian than probably many of us Indians. And he ended up as taking kind of India as his home, and he became the advisor to Pandit Nehru, first Prime Minister, on tribal issues after independence. So when he started his work in Central India in 20s, 30s, 40s, and during that work, he based on his work, he wrote a piece called Abuzma, the area of Abuzma, and based on his work, he came out with an argument that tribals or Adivasis needs to be isolated. They need to be kept away from the rest of the people. Let them be as they are, and let them develop at their own pace. And in contrast to this Elwin's isolationist perspective, we got another view or another argument by G.S. Gure, who was a great sociologist in the country, nationalist scholar in the country, who argued or counter-argued Elwin, saying that tribes are our backward Hindu brothers and sisters. So we need to assimilate them as part of the larger Hindu society, and we should not leave them as in isolation. So we had these two extremes in 50s and 60s, and so whether to leave them in isolation, or whether we should assimilate them as part of the larger Hindu society. and in between, Jawaharlal Nehru tries to bring in the idea of integration. Okay, so isolation to integration, Ghure's argument of assimilation became the major framework or approach, one can say, in our whole policy formulation and in the plan with reference to the tribals in the country. And even after so many years, this particular framework is still relevant and still looked at, that tribals need to be taken away from isolation, and they need to be integrated as part of the larger Indian society, Indian state, and they should be assimilated as part of the larger dominant society. I think this framework dominated throughout our development process of development plans, and in all our discourses, I think this particular framework dominated throughout. However, till about mid-1920s and till from mid-90s to early 2000s, if we look at the tribal and Adivasi studies were going through a vacuum. As in the old, refusing to disappear, and the new struggling to be born. So the old ideas, old propositions, old discourse did not disappear. It continued. It refused to disappear, and it became very difficult to emerge new ideas. So there was a new struggle, always struggling to be new ideas to born. So no progress in domain of theory had been made in this area of tribes or tribal studies. So mostly what was produced was recreation of old anthropological ideas promised on the methods that were as equally degrading sometimes as the ideas themselves, or reproduction of ideas within the theoretical framework that was provided earlier as a superior insight into the concrete tribal social conditions, or advance in any way the tribal epistemological cause. However, during this theoretically saturated state, minor historical rupture took place. With this dominant framework or the epistemology which came from a nationalist scholars, nationalist perspective, which was ruptured slightly in early late 90s or 2000s. So the theory is responsible for partly rupturing these tribal or Adivasi studies. As I was telling you that there was a vacuum, there was the same thing, nothing new. And this rupturing took place, or this break was given earlier by bringing in new thought, new ideas by one of the tribal scholar called Bharjinesh Khaka. In a number of significant writings, he wrote on tribes or Adivasi, and he single-handedly, we consider, challenged the theoretical position of academicians or academics who wrote on tribal studies in India. Okay, he extensively engaged and critically engaged with the scholars like Andhra Bete, L.P. Vidyarthi, Verveer Elvin, G.S. Gure, S.S. Sinha, N.K. Bose, B.K. Roy Burman or K.S. Singh, Ghansam Shah, A.R. Desai, and so on and so forth. So what transpired in this series of theoretical conversation brought to this engagement is very, very significant, and I think very important to elaborate a bit. What he found in the existing writings of some of the nationalist scholars who had engaged on this subject, he brought out 4 core theoretical issues which are very, very fundamental in theorizing tribal or Adivasi studies. First one is the way colonialism is conceptualized. The way the nationalist scholars conceptualize the colonialism or colonialism. Because we all understand that we were ruled by the colonialists and we became independent after the independence, so we became post-colonial after 1947 or 1947. So Khaka had an issue with this particular colonization, the conceptualization of colonization. And I'll come back to this point a little more after a while. Second issue he raised, which is significant, is the way the modernity was framed. Okay, the way modernity was framed from the dominant Western European notion, and how that was populated or expanded further into our post-independent India. And third one is the problematization of development of governance. The way the development, the way the governance was formulated and conceptualized. And the fourth one is the problematics of epistemology, which is the kind of epistemological discord, epistemological discomfort in whole of this knowledge production process with reference to tribes. Khaka is now viewed by many of us as the foremost theoretician within the subject domain of tribal or Adivasi studies today. His work has redefined the theoretical methodological debate on the subject of Adivasi or tribal studies in India. So much so that clear distinct paradigm shift can now be delineated around writings before Khaka and after Khaka. So some of the nationalist writings, whatever we have seen, or even other scholars who have written till Khaka emerged to engage or to counter the existing discourse around these four points. And thereafter, his engagement, the subsequent writings which have started to come. So his writings were fundamentally reframed the debate both methodologically and theoretically. There are many other academics, mostly from caste society, who are currently writing on tribal and Adivasi issues. However, most of the writings do not engage with anything fundamental or substantive. Some uses semi-colonial framework, seeing tribes as part of nation state. Some look at them as part of the peasantry and as part of labor class. Others use the human rights framework and see tribes as citizens whose rights are being denied, and so it has to be protected, and whose autonomy must be protected or restricted, despite keeping their human rights or the rights to be protected by the state. And most of them have enriched tribal and Adivasi studies with more information on specific subjects, relying on archival material or are transcribing or documenting Khaka's framework, constituted by some distinct theoretical propositions, allowing the capturing of very intricate data that many theorists in tribal studies have missed. So some of these new trends which have started to emerge with this Khaka's engagement, counter-argument with the existing theoretical work. To begin with, let me attempt to draw out some of the debates and conceptual arguments before Khaka's writings or what we call it pre-Khaka writings or pre-Khaka era. As I was telling you in the beginning, the colonialism, the concept of colonialism, the concept of post-colonialism or the pre-colonialism, and the experience of post-colonial reality across all societies in India. That was one of the theoretical arguments which emerges. The theorists tend to use the new colonial framework, which as I was telling you. Uh, Secondly, the narrative of Indian modernity stemming from the social evolution. So we tend to see the evolutionist perspective, and so that's we backward to forward, or to undeveloped or underdeveloped to development process. Here, the caste society is seen as the greater tradition, while the tribes are looked at as the smaller traditions. And so the smaller tradition needs to follow the greater tradition, or to go along with the greater tradition. And in that process, accidentally get subsumed or willingly merge into the larger society, that is the caste society. And similarly, third one is the positioning of good governance. As part of the good governance, in the constitution, we got a federal system of governance with legal instruments like Indian Line Permit, Fifth Schedule, Sixth Schedule, and so on and so forth, which provided certain governance provisions, which got incorporated in our Indian constitutions. And fourth one is the conception of development. The notion of development, if you call it, if you see today in any one of these webinars which have been taking place in commemoration of indigenous people's human rights, every webinar you will find that there is a question around the notion or the conception of development. The question is, who decides development? Whose development? Who benefits from this development? And development at whose cost? So these are some of the basic questions are being raised in every deliberations with regard to the notion of development, whatever we have by the nationalist framework of national development. And the last one is the area of knowledge production. The framework which was fundamentally premised around evolutionary approach. Okay, and last one is basically looking at where I'm trying to engage in this deliberation, that is the isolation, integration, and assimilation framework, as I mentioned in the beginning. So after the writings of Khaka, key arguments we want to assert is that there has been fundamental point of view shift in tribal studies. In the post-Khaka framework, the concepts and theoretical positions are fundamentally grounded in the following categories. First one is there is nothing called we are in India, which is post-colonial. We are in the time of post-colonialism. When it comes to the tribes, there have been waves of colonialism. Before independence, tribes were colonialized. We were under the colonial rule of the Britishers. After the independence, they continued to be part of the colony of the caste society. So there are waves of colonialism. So this framework rejects this premise such as post-colonialism or neo-colonialism or semi-colonialism. So the colonialism is fundamental premise for analyzing the Indian reality. So it tries to counters that. Then alternative path to modernity, which is inclusive, and there is no singular path to modernity as defined or experienced by the dominant society. So the tribes in Khaka's perspective could be conceived as non-caste society where each and every one has their own way of modernity. So we cannot have single way of modernity. And similarly, the governance of the state or the government frame on tribals' participation and the engaged governance rather than on imposed or defined by the caste-centric state on tribes. In the name of decentralization, in the name of governance, despite having decentralized system of governance in the village level, we have this local self-governance, we have fifth schedule, sixth schedule, where we the tribal area is supposed to have a special institutional provisions for the governance. However, this is also has been imposed by the state. And yesterday we were discussing in one of the webinars that why, despite having the fifth schedule provisions, why there has not been governance in the hands of the tribes or Adivasis. Despite having the legislation like Panchayat Extension to Schedule Area Act 1996, which allows or which provides that the tribal areas or the villages should be governed as part of the traditional institutions or systems. Why still we do not have, we cannot see that governance system. So it is still in the, despite saying the decentralized governance system, it is always imposed and defined by the state. And in that context, post-Khaka writings or argument is trying to say that it has to be engaged governance, where the tribal peoples are perceived not only as equals but capable of self-governance without being anti-state. They can manage. They're capable of managing. They have been there much before the Indian state came in. So it is not that they did not have any governance system, and so they should be recognized that yes, they can govern themselves, and that autonomy or that freedom should be provided for that kind of governance systems. It doesn't mean that they need to be anti-state. Within the framework of Indian state, how they can be allowed or they can have provision for self-governance. And see, this engaged governance framework is premised on mutual respect, effective safeguards, shared responsibility, peace, non-intrusive relationship, and equitable partnership in development. Further governance from this point of view is conceived from the perspective of change, giving rise to governance spectrum where tribal communities move back and forth across spectrum between lesser degrees or greater degrees of freedom. Fourth one is the current development paradigm. As I was telling you, the present paradigm of development is disempowering the tribals. Present paradigm of development is marginalizing, making it impoverished. Okay, so there is a counter argument that it is not that tribals don't want development. They are not anti-development, but the present notion of development is marginalized. They don't want the notion of development which marginalizes them. They have their own quest of development or change. It is not that they don't want development or change. So to assume that tribes resist development or change is a false premise. The notion that tribes are anti-development is a Western or upper caste or dominant constructed myth. And finally, the knowledge production process. The knowledge production process is fundamentally grounded on the historical approach that accept epistemologies, not single epistemology, producing knowledges rather than a single knowledge. It is from this perspective to studying tribes that decolonial historical approach has emerged. So trying to, as part of the knowledge production process, which has been dominant, which has tried to categorize, tried to objectify, and frame the reality in a particular frame, and define that tribes are such and such. Like T.S. Das, I referred in the beginning itself, how T.S. Das defined that they should be assimilated, or they have been assimilated as part of the Hindu society, and they should be assimilated as part of the dominant Hindu society. So the whole conceptualization of tribe or Adivasi and the whole conceptualization of development process is determined by the knowledge system which has been dominated or influenced by the Western or European notion of development, which has populated or embedded with our caste-dominated nation-state notion of development. So in a post-Khaka tribal study challenges this epistemic blindness or epistemological silence of dominating caste societies about the fundamental nature of Adivasi epistemologies in knowledge production. Fundamental to this pre-Khaka tribal study is non-recognition or even complete negation of debates concerning the tribal or Adivasi epistemology. Most of the time it is ignored that they have an epistemology, they have a knowledge system, completely negating, completely demolishing it. And thus it is observed that over and above often repeated attempts at geographical or political or social or psychological, economic, religious, or even historiographical integration were emphasized. How they can be integrated geographical, political, as Nehru had talked about, or social or psychological integration could be done, or how they can be integrated economically or religiously, or at some time we have been seeing now a recent past that how historiographically they could also be integrated in the single historiography. So theorization in post-Khaka revolves around the epistemological integration. The tribal epistemology also need to be integrated, not only their socio-cultural, political, emotional, psychological, geographical integration or religious, economic integration, but their epistemology also needs to be part of that larger integration of epistemology. So epistemological integration is emphasized in this post-Khaka argument. So that becomes the center stage and constitutes the core of theory knowledge building process. And in this premise, we have something called Tribal Intellectual Collective India. In this premise, the Tribal Intellectual Collective India has been formed in response to the above shifts in theoretical approach. And in order to enhance knowledge, taking off from this new post-Khaka premise. And so this Tribal Intellectual Collective India was formed to provide tribes or Adivasi a broad sense of their own location, context, and macro challenges, and above all, fundamentally confront the mainstream academia, both in lived or shared and in the process involved in the production of knowledge about Adivasis or tribes, in a way that are academic and respectful. When the process is slow, yet critical attempts are being made on this front. And this book I referred, The Problematics of Tribal Integration, is a step in that direction. It tries to engage with theoretical and empirical content that uncover invisible process concerning the tribes, Adivasi societies, and knowledge relating to them. We have earlier other publications as well. We also have online journal which tries to write, which tries to share the tribal realities and the alternative perspective, the alternative epistemology, which we are referring as tribal epistemology. The need to posit epistemological premise that challenge this new epistemology, what we are referring, we expect, and we are trying to see that they challenge gender and class stratification within tribal societies in light of increased complexity, fragmentation, and social inequality within the tribal societies across country. Because there is no homogeneous tribal society. As I said, right from 20-25 number of people community to 40 to 60 lakhs, we have tribes who are still living in the forests, who are still living on depending on the shifting cultivation, to the most Western modern way of life, like in Mizoram. Okay, so if for example, if you see either you visit some of the colonies in say Wanad, and you see some of the colonies, Adivasi colonies, and if you see some of the villages in say for example in Northeast India, I mean hell of a difference. I mean the Asia's cleanest village is located in Northeast. cleanest village. And one of the regions, one of the communities in the country, other tribal communities who can be qualified as the most Western or the modern. Say, for example, Mizoram. Mizoram is only one state which has a single language where, irrespective of education, irrespective of political power or any other power, everybody is same. Everybody speaks same language. Everybody talks about the same culture. Okay, and with reference to the modern indicators of development, health, education, poverty, and anything you take, they are much above the national averages. Okay, so this we have the wide range of communities, and then need to produce knowledge that does not in any way, either consciously or by default, affirm further operation of Dalit and tribal society across length and breadth of Indian society. Then, not producing knowledge that invisibilize or silence or immobilize the small tribes. It cannot happen. The large tribes dominate the small tribe. It can happen. So that is why we are saying that it cannot be one single epistemology, but it has to be epistemologies of each tribe, each community. It has to be, cannot be one single knowledge, but it can be knowledges of every community based on their own reality. Okay, so the care must be taken while theorizing, developing the light of this kind of reality we are now, and so we are taking this position of that this perspective, this discourse has to come from within, from the community, and that's why we are saying the perspective is from within. It is not for, not by. It is from the community itself. Okay, and in this context, if we look at, as I was telling you, this isolation, assimilation, integration framework, this has began with the long history. I'm trying to make it short, and if we see that the integration of multiple alternative centers, we refer when we talk of in Adivasis in Indian state. And it is very complex, and each tribe across the length and breadth of a country has a different story to tell. Okay, so isolation, integration, or assimilation of tribes or caste society is often perceived as freedom, negotiation, and adaptation respectively by the tribes or Adivasis themselves. In other words, what is conceived as isolation by the caste societies or theorists is perceived as freedom by tribes or Adivasi societies. Because when they were isolated, they were far from the mainstream society or the dominant society. They had freedom. They were far away. They were far away from the nation state. They had the freedom of their own. They had their own governance system. They have their own language, culture to celebrate. They have got their own history. They had their own command over their resources. They had that freedom. So isolation doesn't mean he is very, very backward. So what the dominant society looks at isolation as very, very negative or degraded or very backward, from the tribal point of view or Adivasi point of view, it is a freedom from everyone. They have their own life, they have their own society, they have got their own way of life. Okay, and so what is considered as integration by the larger caste society or theories is understood as a constant process of negotiation by the Adivasi theorist or Adivasi perspective. Because when we are integration, we are in the process of integration, there is a constant negotiation process in the democratic setup which has been imposed on the tribal society. Okay, so when they are integrating, we say that yes, everybody has a space, and to have one space, now one has to negotiate, constantly negotiate to be able to have occupy one space or to make space. So negotiation is the space of, or integration is the space of negotiation. Okay, in the same way, what is conceived as assimilation for caste society is experienced by Adivasis or tribes as adaptation. When they adapt, either absolutely, severely, that's where um, uh, the adapted communities or the members, they are almost getting submerged with another culture. Okay, they are getting submerged or getting adopted by another system, either it is of knowledge, or it is of culture, or it is of mode of development or notion of development. So I'll not get into little detail on this, but to try to reduce my discussion here. Um, when it comes to assimilation, we see that there are severe assimilation as well as absolute assimilation. Okay. Now, there are also some concepts from some of the scholars we have looked at from Latin America, Africa, like Boaventura de Souza, one of the Latin America scholars who talks about epistemologies of South. He refers that how the dominant epistemology has killed the epistemology of indigenous communities. And so he used the concept of epistemicide, murder of knowledge system. Okay, so in assimilation process, or either it is severe assimilation or absolute assimilation. When it comes to assimilation, we in our book we were trying to say it could be severe assimilation or absolute assimilation. So and so when there is assimilation, there is an epistemicide of the epistemology of indigenous communities or Adivasis. And so there is unequal exchanges, like what Boaventura says. Unequal exchanges among cultures have always implied the death of knowledge of the subordinated culture, hence the death of the social group that possessed it. Okay, so we have what we see that this notion or this framework of isolation or integration or assimilation is problematic. It is problematic, and I shared with you, and this book tries to talks about this framework and tries to see that try to conceptualize or reconceptualize this framework of which is dominantly looked at as isolation to integration to assimilation, which turns to isolation leading to freedom and integration leading to negotiation and assimilation leading to adaptation. So wherever I briefly I told that whenever there is isolation, there is freedom, and so they have their own epistemology. They live their own history. They can live their own culture. They can have their own distinct identity. They can have their own way of governance systems. They can have their own way of life. So they have the epistemological stability when there is freedom or they are in isolation. Whereas when they are in negotiation or in the integration stage, there is constant dialogue, negotiation. Okay, and so in order to create or in order to assert, always there is kind of claim, reclaim of spaces. There has been attempt to destroy, there is or steps, initiation of distortions or losing out, and reassertions to have their own spaces. Whereas, and also there is, when we move to assimilation, there, as I told you, either it could be severe assimilation or absolute assimilation. Um, for example, one example I'll give you. One of my students was doing internship in Kerala, and as part of her internship, did a small study of these tribal residential schools. And she interviewed some students, some parents, and some of the parents shared that by going to the ashram school, there has been a kind of alienation between the children who are studying in the residential schools and their parents and their families. Because the kind of distortion taking place in the mind of the children in the schools with regard to tribals are backward, primitive, you eat this, you drink this, you live like this. The kind of inferiorization of their own way of life has been taking place in the minds of children. And so one day, when it comes to holidays or vacation, it becomes very difficult for them to live in the normal way or interact with the parents. So the parents feel somehow that the children are getting alienated from their own families or their own parents. So we can see that, yes, as part of the development, they should be educated, and they should be, why should they be in the remote isolated areas? And so they should be educated. And so at part of the education, at part of the development process, we can see how they are getting alienated. And so that's the point I'm trying to say, that how when we see the communities getting assimilated, how is adoption or observance of their life or way of life in their worldview or in their way of looking at things. So so it is in fact that last few lines I'll have, that Adivasis cannot set the rules of the game when the dominance or the hegemons or hegemony had intervened or invented. And as no matter of consequence, it is within our reach to attempt the production of an emancipatory discourse that will free our conceptual world from theoretical grip of colonial frames, to challenge the production of modern tribal subject molded in the image of hegemonic societies, dominant society which has hegemony. This world was not born only in the dominance image of the other, Edward said, and neither only for their sole convenience. So as tribes and Adivasis, we have reached a point where we are tired of being made mere object of inquiry as part of the knowledge building process which has been done by the so-called nationalists or so-called scholars in somebody else's truth formulations. I become the object of research, object of inquiry for somebody's inquiry, somebody's formulation, somebody's theorization, somebody is discourse. In the time of, this is the time to restore ourselves, the agency to reflect organically on our own experience has arrived. Based on our own experience, based on our lived experience, we are trying to see that reformulate, restore ourselves, and create alternative epistemology, alternative process of knowledge production. Thank you.